If I were to ask you to list out some of the greatest rivalries in the wizarding world, who would come to your mind? Perhaps Dumbledore versus Grindelwald, Harry versus Voldemort, or maybe even Harry versus Draco. But what if I were to tell you that there is a hidden rivalry in the movies? A conflict that involves a dark wizard and a kind-hearted, muggle-loving family man. That's right, in the books, one of the greatest feuds we get to witness is actually Lucius Malfoy versus Arthur Weasley. Sadly, because the movies brush this under the rug, we miss out on some key scenes that reveal Mr. Weasley's fierce Gryffindor nature and Lucius Malfoy's dark secrets. But thankfully today, as we uncover one of the most pivotal chapters in the Chamber of Secrets book, we'll get to witness the true nature of this iconic feud between two purebloods with drastically different morals and beliefs. On one hand, we'll reveal Malfoy's dark magic contraband and how it foreshadows the future of Harry's school year, and on the other, we'll see the real Mr. Weasley as he doesn't back down from Lucius Malfoy's comments in Flourish and Blots. And spoiler alert, it might end with Lucius getting a well-deserved beating. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 19 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Harry Potter Edition. This is the show where I compare the Harry Potter movies to J.K. Rowling's original book series and find all the differences along the way. Like I said, today we're pulling back the veil on one of the most integral moments in Harry's second year in the wizarding world, which is his trip to Diagon Alley. Just like the first book, this trip before he heads to Hogwarts provides the reader with key bits of lore, foreshadowing, and character development. But unfortunately, the movie didn't seem to think these moments were very important, and often cut these scenes down quite a bit. Things like the Malfoy's darkest secrets got cut, and therefore left villains like Lucius with a half-baked character arc. So buckle up as we dive into Harry's trip to Nocturne and Diagon Alley and reveal what really happened. By the way, shout out to this commenter. Each week I highlight one of my favorite comments, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across our four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened in the movie's version of this chapter. Picking up from where we left off last week, we see Errol the Owl delivering Hogwarts letters to the Weasleys and Harry. After reading that they'll need new books, Mrs. Weasley says they'll have to go to Diagon Alley, and we cut to them standing around their fire as they show Harry how to use the Floo network. After Harry incorrectly says Diagon Alley, he is transported to a random shop that doesn't look too nice. He walks around for a bit, and after nearly getting trapped in a gross-looking hand, he escapes the dark shop into an alleyway that he's never seen before. Obviously lost, he tries to make his way out, but is surrounded by evil-looking wizards and witches, and then thankfully, he is saved by Hagrid. After Hagrid gets Harry out of what we learn is Nocturne Alley, Harry explains that he got lost, and then they run into Hermione. She fixes Harry's glasses, and then she takes Harry from Hagrid and leads him to Flourish and Blots, a bookstore where the Weasleys are waiting. They're thankful to see Harry, but they quickly get distracted again as Gilderoy Lockhart makes his first appearance for his book signing. But before he starts signing anything, he spots Harry Potter in the audience and brings him forward for a photo shoot, and then gives him his entire collection of books for free. Harry awkwardly walks off, and as he and the Weasley kids are trying to walk out of the shop, Draco Malfoy stops them and takes some verbal jabs at Harry. But Ginny to the rescue as she stands up for Harry and then quickly gets a rude comment from Malfoy as well. Before things can escalate further, however, Draco's father, Lucius, shows up and calms him down. But that doesn't mean the rude comments are done, as Lucius has his own way of handling these situations, and he isn't that nice. After Lucius picks up one of the books in Ginny's cauldron and guesses correctly that the kids around him are the Weasleys, Arthur Weasley walks up and handles him, telling him that they have very different ideas of what disgraces the name of wizard. Lucius then sets Ginny's book back in her cauldron, and he and Draco take their leave, and that is where our scenes end for this week. Pretty short, right? Well, the book is quite different as we visit other locations, talk to other characters, and just get way more context for the events than what gets shown here. So let's go ahead and dive into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location changes. First, for characters, we're missing one key character, Mr. Borgin of Borgin and Burkes. He's actually involved quite a bit, and I'll address that later once we get to the plot changes, as it further involves Lucius Malfoy and his sinister secrets that the movie doesn't show. Also, a small character description change is the fact that in the book, it's said that Lockhart is wearing a pointy wizard's hat. Obviously, that's not the case in the movie, probably so his beautiful hair isn't covered. Next, for timeline, we have our usual change of the story being ultra condensed. In a moment, we'll talk about some of Harry's time at the Burrow and how the movie skips straight from their breakfast to Diagon Alley, when that isn't the case in the book. And lastly, as for location, we're only missing Gringotts, as J.K. Rowling makes a point of having Harry and the Weasleys go there to get money before they're shopping. This makes sense, and I think the movies just removed it because it can be assumed by the viewer that they went there, However, as we'll get to in a minute, the reason for including this in the book is actually to build out some key character narratives and themes. Before I jump into the plot changes, I just want to remind you that I can't cover each word spoken since that would take forever, but I'll try my best to fill in the dialogue gaps that the movie omits. However, if you're wanting to relive these moments for yourself, check out my link in the description and claim your free trial of Audible. This gets you one free audiobook so you can follow along with me as I cover the Chamber of Secrets. Anyway, let's get into the plot changes. After a few weeks of having cliffhanger chapters, we finally have a chapter in the book which skips over a couple weeks of activities. Namely, Harry's month at the Burrow is not described in full because, well, there's no need to do that. However, at the beginning of chapter 3 in the Chamber of Secrets, Harry does take note of a couple things about his time at the Weasleys. First, Harry notices how different the Burrow is from Privet Drive. Specifically, he realizes how neat and orderly the Dursleys kept things at their home, as everything in the Weasleys' house was quite random and strange. A couple of these strange things were the ghoul in the attic, which would bang on the pipes and randomly howl, and a mirror in the kitchen which shouted at Harry to tuck in his shirt whenever he looked into it. Also, Harry would randomly hear explosions from Fred and George's room, but nobody seemed to notice, as evidently that was a normal activity for them. The second thing Harry notes is that he wasn't used to how much attention he was getting. Mrs. Weasley would fuss over his clothing and force him to eat more food than normal because of how skinny she thought he was. Plus, Mr. Weasley took a liking to Harry and constantly asked him about how Muggle inventions and services worked, like the post office. But after we get this brief summary of Harry's time in between the chapters, we finally catch up to the present and have our next change. This change is more of an omission than a direct alteration of the story, as technically in the movie, they do make note of how their school books won't come cheap. The omission is the key detail of why the books won't come cheap. Here's what happens in the book. After the letters arrive one morning, they all take some time to read through their textbook requirements, and are shocked to see that they'll need the Standard Book of Spells by Miranda Goshawk, and 7 books by Gilderoy Lockhart. Typically, they probably would have only needed the Standard Book of Spells, but having to buy 7 extra textbooks is what makes this lot so expensive. Fred remarks that whoever the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor is must love Lockhart, and then he adds that it must be a witch. It's then after this key information that George tells his mom that they'll be expensive, as Lockhart's books don't come cheap. I don't know about you, but to me, this is critical context, and it also plays into 2 different subplots. First, the subplot of Gilderoy Lockhart being their new professor, and second, the subplot of Harry being embarrassed about his inherited wealth as he stays with the Weasleys. Now, before we get to Diagon Alley, we actually have a few other changes at the Burrow. After they read their letters, Percy walks into the room fully dressed with his prefect badge on, and as he sits down for breakfast, he accidentally sits on Errol. That's when they realize Errol actually had another letter in his grasp, and this one was from Hermione. After Ron grabbed the letter, he tried to stand Errol up on a perch, but the bird was still limp. That's when Ron says pathetic as he lay Errol down on the ground. Next, we of course have Hermione's letter, which the movie omits. I can't go word for word over the contents of the letter, but pretty much Ron had told her that they were going to rescue Harry. So, as you might have guessed, Hermione wrote back saying that she hoped Ron wasn't going to do anything illegal that would get them in trouble. Then she said that she was very busy with school, which surprised Harry and Ron as the school year hadn't even started yet. And finally, she told them that she could meet them in Diagon Alley. And lastly, we have one more omission from the book before we get to Diagon Alley, which is their time playing Quidditch at the Burrow. As Harry Potter fans know well, the game of Quidditch is seriously cut short in the movies, and that includes a fun moment in this chapter which has Harry playing in the Weasleys' backyard. After receiving their letters, we learn that they all went up to a paddock surrounded by trees to play the game. Everyone took turn flying on Harry's broom, as his was far faster than everyone else's. And because they had Muggle neighbors, they had to use apples as the balls because the bludgers or the snitch might fly off into a Muggle's yard. It's during this playtime that Fred and George further discuss how they can't afford anything new or this massive list of books, and Harry thinks to himself about his own small fortune, and how he's kept that a secret from even the Dursleys for fear of them trying to claim it all. And it's on this guilty note that the book heads into the second half of the chapter, which is all about their time in Diagon Alley. And as you know, this is where some of our biggest changes come into view. So hang on tight as we dive into this next section. The first few changes are super small, but of course you know the deal, I still gotta mention them. First, it is actually Fred who demonstrates how to use flute powder, not Ron. Honestly, in the books, they build out Fred and George to be a lot more of main characters than in the first few films. I know Ron gets the honor of demonstrating flute powder in the movie, and obviously that's to include him more as he is Harry's best friend. But in the books, especially during this chapter, Fred and George do way more talking than Ron. Anyway, the second small change is that flute powder works slightly different. The movie does it in a cool way, so I'm not complaining, but in the book, they throw the powder into the fire, it lights up, and then they step inside the flames and announce where they're going. In the movie, it shows them throwing the powder at their feet as they say the name of where they're going, so slightly different, but not that big of a deal. The third smaller change is that the movie omits the detail of Harry getting out at the right grate. In the movie, we do get a line from the Weasleys about how they hoped Harry had only gone one grate too far, but that's it. In the book, before Harry takes the flu powder, Mrs. Weasley tells him to get out at the right grate. Essentially, once you say the name of where you're going, the network will show you all the different grates in that location, and it's your job to select the right one. Well, an unexperienced wizard can easily miss their exit, so to speak, and that's what they're saying in the book. Obviously, this is again a small change, and it doesn't massively affect anything else in the movie, but it's just a little extra detail about the wizarding world, which I know we all love. Lastly, the fourth change regarding Harry's flu powder experience is the fact that he has a reason for messing up his first time. You see, in the book, as he is about to go, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ron are all giving him advice like keep your mouth shut, don't fidget, don't get out too early, and so on. All of this info overwhelms Harry as they're all talking at the same time, and then right before he could say Diagon Alley, he got a mouthful of soot from the previous travelers. All of this together caused him to stutter when saying Diagon Alley, resulting in him going to the wrong location. And speaking of the wrong location, now that we've covered a few smaller changes that don't really affect anything, how about we address one of the largest omissions of the whole movie? Of course, I'm talking about Harry's time in Borgin and Burke's. That's right, the shop in Knockturn Alley that Harry gets lost in is none other than the iconic Borgin and Burke's, which is later used by Draco in the Half-Blood Prince. But that's a story for later. Now let's focus on the missing moment, which is Lucius and Draco's visit to the shop while Harry is there. This is a key moment in the plot and foreshadows a lot of what's to come, but sadly it got removed from the film. In the movie, they simply show Harry walking around and then walking out of the store and getting saved by Hagrid. But the book tells a completely different story. To try and summarize it in the best way possible, I'm just going to list off the main order of events from the chapter. First, Harry tries to exit, but as he goes towards the door, he sees Draco and someone who looks like his father walking up to the storefront. Knowing that Draco is the last person he'd want to see right now, Harry quickly hid in a large black cabinet nearby. Real quick, I can't remember if it is, but perhaps this is the same cabinet Draco uses later in the series. Let me know in the comments if you think it is. Next, Harry left a crack in the cabinet door and watched and listened as Draco complained to his father about how he wanted a present, and Lucius said that he'd buy Draco a racing broom. The mention of a broom triggers Draco to start whining about Harry and how everyone likes him and how he got a Nimbus 2000 to be on the Gryffindor team last year. Then we get an interesting remark from Lucius as he tells Draco that it isn't prudent to seem less than fond of Harry when most wizards regard him as the hero who took down the Dark Lord. I know Harry had already heard from the Weasleys that Lucius was in league with Voldemort, but this further confirms it as no one calls Voldemort the Dark Lord like that unless they're on his side. Anyway, the next thing we read is that Mr. Borgin came in and spoke with Lucius. Mr. Malfoy goes on to tell him that he'd be selling today, not buying, much to the disappointment of the shop owner, and then Harry overheard that Lucius thought some of his items at home might be embarrassing if the Ministry were to raid his house. We then get more context that the Ministry might be passing a new Muggle Protection Act, and that they're conducting more raids on wizarding homes. Suddenly, Draco spoke up saying that he wanted the withered hand in the shop, the same hand that we see Harry get trapped in the movie. Then Mr. Borgin, eager to sell something, rushed over to Draco and told him that if you put a candle in the hand, it would only give light to the person holding it, and it is the best friend of thieves and plunderers. Lucius then takes offense to this, stating that he hopes his son will become more than a thief, but then added that if his grades continue to be poor, then perhaps his son will be a plunderer. Draco then whined and remarked about how the professors all favored Hermione Granger, and it wasn't his fault. This did not make his dad happy, as Lucius then said that he thought Draco would be more ashamed of himself about a Muggle-born beating him in every exam. And finally, after a bit of haggling and a close call with Draco nearly opening the cabinet that Harry was hiding in, the Malfoys left and Harry was able to make his escape. Then we have a very similar moment to the movie in which Harry stumbles around Knockturn Alley and then gets rescued by Hagrid. Now I know that was a massive omission, and fun fact, the extended edition of this movie actually includes a scene which is meant to be inspired by this moment. Of course, even that extended scene has its flaws, but we'll save that for the bonus episode at the end of this movie. For now, let's get back into our changes as we aren't out of Diagon Alley yet, and this isn't the last time that we'll see Lucius Malfoy. But I do want to let you know to keep this moment in mind, as later in this movie and book, we'll discuss about how this moment affects Lucius and his family, as Harry isn't quick to forget that Lucius is hiding dark magical items in his manor. Anyway, the next change we have is in regard to Harry getting back to everyone else. The movie shows Hermione running into Hagrid and Harry in the alley and then taking Harry to the bookstore where the Weasleys are, but the book is completely different. First, Harry tells Hagrid all about Dobby and what happened with the Dursleys, because Hagrid asked Harry why he hadn't written him back. Second, Hermione never repairs Harry's glasses, but it's actually Mr. Weasley who does. Again, underage wizards aren't allowed to do magic outside of school. You guys can debate about it in the comments all you want, as we've already had this discussion before, but there's really no arguing in my opinion. There's a reason why she couldn't do magic outside of school in the book, but in the movie, we're 2 for 2. Check out my episode about their train ride to Hogwarts and the Philosopher's Stone to learn more about her first offense. Now, speaking of the Weasleys, that's our next change. In the book, the Weasleys are very worried and running to come meet Harry once they see that he's in the alley with Hagrid. This is totally different from the movie. In the movie, they must not have cared one bit, as they're too distracted by Lockhart's appearance at the bookstore to care what happened to Harry. It's actually a little crazy once you compare the two, because in the book, you literally have the Weasleys sprinting down the street and panting, telling Harry that Mrs. Weasley has been frantic since they lost him. Then you cut to the movie, and Harry barely gets a glance. In my opinion, it's kind of a strange interpretation of events. Anyway, after Harry meets up with everyone, he tells them who he saw in Borgin and Burke's, and Mr. Weasley immediately perks up and asks him if Lucius bought anything. Harry says no, he was selling, and Mr. Weasley remarks about how Lucius must be worried, and we can tell that Mr. Weasley is quite satisfied by that. However, Mrs. Weasley tells him not to get mixed up with the Malfoys. Before they can continue the conversation, however, Mr. Weasley gets distracted by Hermione and her parents, and began asking them questions as they might have been the only muggles in Diagon Alley. Next, we have the omission of Gringotts. I know, a lot has been removed so far today, and we aren't done yet. But pretty much after Harry reconvenes with the Weasleys and Hermione, they all head into Gringotts to get some money before going on their shopping spree. Once again, the topic of the Weasleys' financial situation is brought to surface, as Harry watches them open their vault and sees that they only have 1 gold galleon inside, along with some silver sickles. Once they got to Harry's vault, he quickly brushed some gold into his pouch and tried to cover as much as he could so they couldn't see inside his vault. Now, after this visit to Gringotts, there's a quick summary of things that happened between that time and their visit to Flourish and Blotts, the bookstore. So here's a brief rundown. First, Harry bought himself and his friends some ice cream. Second, they then went to get ink and parchment for Hermione. Third, they went inside the joke shop and saw Fred and George stocking up for school, along with their friend Lee Jordan. Fourth, they then saw Percy in the corner of a shop immersed in a book called Prefects Who Gained Power. Ron then told Hermione and Harry that Percy planned on becoming Minister of Magic someday. And boy oh boy do we see how that turned out later in the series. And finally, after all this fun, they went to Flourish and Blotts, and after seeing how busy it was, realized that Gilderoy Lockhart was having a book signing right at that moment. And speaking of Lockhart's signing, there's one major difference with that interaction, which is that he actually announces at that moment that he'd be taking up the post of Defense against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts that year. In the movie, once again, they saved this for later, but the book has been building up to it for a while now, and this was the big payoff. As for Harry's part in this moment, after being handed Gilderoy's entire set of books, he gave them to Ginny, telling her that he'd buy his own. Now finally, we come to our last change, and perhaps the most dramatic one of this entire episode, which is the removal of Arthur Weasley's fight with Lucius Malfoy. You see, in the movie, they make Arthur be the bigger man, and the scene cuts to King's Cross, but the book takes a different route, as after Lucius insults the Weasleys, Arthur lunges at him and a full-on brawl breaks out for a few good seconds before Hagrid comes over and breaks them up. The fight resulted in Mr. Weasley leaving with a cut lip and Mr. Malfoy with a black eye. So yeah, it was pretty intense. This is drastically different from the fun-loving, passive father we see in the movie. I kind of like this moment as it shows a more realistic idea of what life for the Weasleys was probably like. I am sure that this was the boiling point, as Lucius had probably been bothering Arthur Weasley at work for ages. And although it's good to show the good guy taking the high road, I like that Lucius got a good old-fashioned beating, no wand necessary. And that wraps up all of our changes for this week. As you can see, between the omission of Arthur Weasley's brawl with Lucius, as well as Lucius and Draco's visit to Borgin and Burke's, the movie left out quite a bit of the juicy part of Harry's time in Diagon Alley. These moments aren't just throwaways, but further add to key plot points like the idea of Horcruxes, the Malfoys' later involvement in Voldemort's plans, and Mr. Weasley's job at the Ministry. On top of the changes made to this epic feud between two pureblood wizarding families, we have smaller moments that got cut, like the details of why their schoolbook lists this year were abnormally expensive. A detail which I think could have easily been included and helped to explain why it was so difficult for the Weasleys to afford it all. But hey, that's just my opinion. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about the changes for this week? Do you wish that they would have included Lucius and Draco's visit to Borgin and Burke's? Let me know in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.